But I have the distinct pleasure of introducing our luncheon speaker today. John McWhorter probably needs very little introduction. Many of you are probably already aware of him and his incredible work. But let me say a few words for those of you who may not be familiar. John McWhorter started out as a precocious child, by which I mean he left high school at the end of 10th grade and went straight to college. He went to Simon's Rock and eventually finished up with a BA in French from Rutgers University. He followed that with a master's degree in American Studies from New York University, NYU. And here's another way to stake a Stanford claim on people. He got his PhD at Stanford in linguistics. He has taught at Cornell, UC Berkeley, and since 2008 has been an associate professor of linguistics at Columbia University. One might think that that was enough, but he is actually a multifaceted scholar and a multi-accomplished thought leader. He studies and writes on linguistics, music, thought movements, racism, and anti-racism. And there's probably not a major media outlet today that has not featured his work. And since 2021, he's become a columnist for the New York Times with a hearty following of supporters and detractors. Anybody who wants an education in the issues of racism and social friction today should just read the comments in a McWhorter column. As with all of our speakers, I'm about to reveal his secret guilty COVID pleasure. He has binge-watched all 11 seasons of The Jeffersons. It's my pleasure to bring John McWhorter to the stage.
Thank you, Mackie, and thank you to the Hoover Institution for inviting me to give this talk. I don't want to take up too much of your time, but in terms of the topics that are of interest here, I thought that I would lend some of the things that have worried me most, if anybody asked me, and some people wouldn't ask me, but if anybody did ask me, about the state of education in this country today. And the things that worry me number roughly 5. And they're things that I hope to see some sort of change on over the next 5 to 10 years for various reasons, one can hope. But it seems to me from watching these sorts of issues, mostly from a polite distance, I am not an educator from K to 12 myself, but it's a topic that mildly obsesses me. It seems to me that these are the 5 things that are perpetual problems and that create perpetual debate, and that I think could be done better in ways that are solvable. One of those things, and which has already come up at this summit, is the issue of phonics versus whole word. And I know that that's an old battle, but it seems to me that if we're really interested in spreading opportunity in education, especially for underserved kids, and of course that means disproportionately black kids, then few things could be more important than the way children are taught to read, because as all of you know, if you don't read well, that's it. You're not going to like school in general, and that is fatal to the general trajectory of your life. And one of the things that is most counterintuitive to outside observers of how reading is taught in this crazy spelling system of a language like English is the idea that you would not focus on teaching people how to sound out words. It's something that really confused me when I started looking at these sorts of things about 30 years ago, seeing what's taught at many education schools. How do you teach a child to read? Especially, how do you teach a child to read from a home that isn't book-lined? How do you teach a child to read where life is fundamentally oral, and then there are these symbols scratched on a page? And of course, there is a philosophy that the way to do this is to surround the child with books. The idea being that a frisky child will osmose, as it were, from pages that had pretty pictures on them. And you know what? That's probably how most of us learn to read. I don't remember learning how to read. I was fortunate enough to grow up in a book-lined home. You just drink it in. That is a minority circumstance. That is not how most human beings learn to read. And there is nothing sadder than watching, in my case, kids from underserved, for example, black communities, being imposed with reading teaching that seems to be based on an idea that you're just going to take it in because the teacher is enthusiastic, when the simple fact is that it's been proven again and again by reading science that the best way to teach a small human being how to read English is to, big surprise, teach them carefully how to sound out words. It's been proven again and again, as if anybody should ever have needed to prove it, but reading science has proven it. And yet there is an element in the educational establishment that insists not necessarily that the whole word method is the only method, but that there should be a combination. But the problem is there's no evidence that a combination is better either. The evidence is that a phonics-based method is what works the best. And that's been known since Lyndon B. Johnson was president. And I have found it fascinating to talk to people who feel differently, because the truth is, no one is crazy, for the most part. It's not that someone's crazy. Very few people have nefarious motives when they disagree with you about things like this, and yet, I've often wanted to know, why wouldn't you want to teach people how to sound out words? Why wouldn't you use a direct instruction program like Success for All? And I've spoken to some very well-intentioned teachers, warm, intelligent, very good teachers. And I remember two of them who told me, and no, the plural of anecdote is not data, but I get the strong feeling that these two people are representative of a frame of mind. They told me very earnestly, they said, John, you know, the problem with teaching students how to read from these phonics programs is that it's not very interesting for the teacher, that it's boring, that it's too sterile. I get what they mean, in that they want to be more creative, they want to be more holistic, and, you know, there are books where you can, from your own home, teach your child through the phonics method. I've used it with both of mine. Siegfried Engelmann's Teach Your Child to Read in 100 Easy Lessons, and I would say, every night you sit down with your child. I wanted my older one in particular to learn faster, and her teachers very sweetly said we wouldn't be allowed to teach them this way. And I thought, no, mine is going to learn. So got that book, and you have to sit there with it every night. I can't say that it was like the 4th of July every night to teach Dahlia how to read through that method. However, it worked, and I found myself thinking, imagine if she didn't live in a book-lined home like this one. I would want this to be what my taxpayer dollars were for. And yet, it's not the case in too many communities where it's really everything that the kids need. And so my feeling has often been that one of the most anti-racist things you could do in many big cities is to make it so that teachers' unions were solidly behind the utterly evidence-backed reality of the fact that phonics is what works. The idea should be to hold education officials accountable for standing behind that and making sure that it's available to as many people as possible. When I think to myself of what can I do to make black lives better, I have often confounded people by talking about things like Success for All and direct instruction, because I really believe it would have a direct effect. People need to be taught beyond our circles that this is not a dry issue. A related one, and being on this campus reminds me of when this sort of thing was discussed more, but it's still around, is the idea that if you're gonna teach black kids in particular, and it's a very important issue, that it's gonna be different, that to talk only about phonics is missing something about being someone who, for example, uses a home dialect at home that differs in certain ways from standard English. So many people will tell you, very well-intentioned and well-informed people, that if somebody speaks what's often called Ebonics in the home, then standard English has to be taught to them using Ebonics as a kind of bridge, because these students are hobbled by the fact that their sense of language is based on the very legitimate and coherent structures of black English, but what's on the page, what's being spoken to them is this standard English, which is a different and perhaps even somewhat sociologically alien dialect. That is an idea that became popular as far back as 1971. And one wishes to listen to it because the truth is, if you are a kid in Haiti and you speak Haitian Creole and suddenly school is in French, you have a problem because Haitian Creole is here and French is here. If you are a Jamaican kid and you grow up speaking real Jamaican patois of a kind that almost none of us in this room could understand, and then there's standard English, well, Jamaican patois, it's not here, but it's here, and standard English is here. That's too much to expect all kids to jump. Now, many people are making an analogy between these two cases and Black English. And you think to yourself at first, okay, is there a hitherto unacknowledged jump that we're expecting kids to make? This is the problem. There are now many, many people who've spent many decades arguing that that is the case, and some of it is based on a very understandable quest to be part of a search for ways to undo how structural racism affects Black people of all ages. It makes perfect sense. But the evidence has never suggested that the gap between standard English and Black English is such that that kind of approach is necessary. Study after study after study have shown that it isn't an important issue. Now, in a perfect world, if all Black kids whose primary dialect was Black English were given particular exercises allowing them to make a transition between Black English and standard English, there's evidence that it would make some difference. But the question, in a country where most districts are cash-strapped and there is diversity far beyond that involving the difference between Black kids and other kids and all the other issues that we're familiar with, the issue is whether it would make enough difference to attend to with formal materials. And to tell you the truth, Project Follow-Through, led by Siegfried Engelmann back in 1963, already showed, it was a beautiful, beautiful study, and long-term, everything that any education specialist wants, beautiful study, showed that the way that is most effective in teaching even poor kids, and that includes poor Black kids, how to read, is just using phonics-based direct instruction. And if you look at the studies about whether using Ebonics as a bridge and teaching kids to explicitly think about the difference between Black English and standard English is important, you just don't see the evidence. I remember studying linguistics right over there back in the early 90s, and the School of Education, I don't know if this is still true, it was right over there. So there was a whole lot of interaction between the two places. And I remember people writing master's theses and dissertations exploring whether, and this is what you would do, you want to see if the mistakes that Black kids make in school are disproportionately ones that suggest that they're thinking in Black English rather than standard English. And I remember way back then noticing that again and again, people who were going for that tack weren't finding it. It was elusive. You'd expect to find it, but the question is, are you going to find it? And they never seemed to quite find it. Back then, I didn't have any dog in the fight, but I do remember going to those talks and finding that that didn't seem to work. And all sorts of things have happened since then. One of the deans of the academic study of Black English, William Labov, has done some papers where one, he called attention. He was the pioneer in calling attention to the systematicity, to the legitimacy of Black English. That's one thing. But I remember he had one paper, a very thorough paper, where he showed that if you look at mistakes that Black kids make in terms of writing compositions, in terms of learning how to read, you don't see that it's Black English that's the problem. They're just making the same kinds of mistakes that other kids do. That's a problem in itself. But it puts into question the idea that Black English is the barrier. Other studies, it gets almost confounding. One study, it's a relatively recent study, shows that if you take Black kids who don't speak much Black English, speak mostly Black English, and then speak some Black English, the strongest readers are the ones who speak almost none and who speak almost all. The ones in the middle have the problem. So if you don't speak any, you're a good reader. That's what you would expect of standard English. If you speak almost all Black English, you're as good as them. It's the ones in the middle. Now, that's weird. I'm not sure what you do about it, but it shows that the basic thesis that being somebody who uses Black English at home hobbles you from learning to read standard English because you're thinking in a different code, these kids show that that's clearly not quite the case. It goes on and on. And so, I think that Black kids' needs in education, and especially in learning to read, need to be attended to. But in this case, what the literature shows is that what we have to do away with is a teacher thinking that Black English is bad. And that's something that I think there's been significant progress on over the past 25 years, although the job is not completely done yet. If a teacher thinks that Black English is broken English, then even if she or he doesn't show that explicitly, it can help to turn a kid off from school. The idea that a kid can't speak the way they speak when they're comfortable in the classroom. What a wonderful way to make a kid never like school. And so it should be like a place in Germany where the local dialect is frankly often more different from German itself than Black English is from standard. Nobody in those places is not allowed to talk the way they talk in school. The idea is that you will learn the other code gradually. To the extent that any kid is told no Black English here, they are being done a racist, even if it's unintentional, disservice. And so all efforts to show that Black English is okay are very important. The idea that you need to have extra materials specifically for Black kids because they're hobbled by the language that they speak at home, when frankly, they also hear every bit as much standard English at home anyway, and that's been shown by study after study. I think that that's a bit of a distraction, and I must admit that when I see some people who are trained, often in a combination of language and education, working from that direction, I just think the energy is noble, but it would be better served if you pushed for phonics and direct instruction and just made sure that people knew that Black English is okay. Because the translation aspect of these things just doesn't make enough of a difference to merit our attention given the crisis in question. That worries me a lot. Another thing that worries me, and now I'm going to sound like a hack newspaper columnist, but it does worry me, is this particular debate over critical race theory. And this is what I mean. Critical race theory, as a series of papers written by legal scholars decades ago, nobody is teaching that to kids. And so we have this whole op-ed debate over whether CRT is being taught to kids, where the obvious answer is no. Nobody is teaching those papers to people who are 8 years old. However, the issue is that CRT-derived ideas are being exposed to a lot of kids in both public and private schools, and what people who are uncomfortable with that mean, and I am quite explicitly one of the people who is uncomfortable with that, is the idea that you're teaching that issues of social justice are to be central to what even small children learn. Social justice is very important. An education that doesn't include it, I think, should be considered primitive by our standards. But the idea that it should be taken and put in the middle, that everything should be filtered through a notion of what's often put as empathy in education circles, but what it means is that social justice should be part of everything that you're taught. That is an interesting position. I understand its motivation, but I don't think all even well-intentioned people would agree with it. And that is what most people mean if they are anywhere left of center and are uncomfortable with quote-unquote CRT being taught in schools. Social justice should be one of maybe 10 things that are central to what kids are being taught. To put it in the middle, I think reflects a certain political orientation, which is thoroughly respectable, but it's not one that I think anybody can make a coherent case should be universal. That's the issue. But the right is culpable in that there are people on the right who say that they don't want critical race theory taught in schools, where what they mean is that injustice of any kind, especially having to do with power differentials and especially having to do with race, should just be elided. The idea that no kid should learn anything about people being of different colors, that people of color have a repulsive and unjust history in this country, shouldn't be taught anything about slavery, that is, as a person might put it, just stirring all of that stuff up. That is primitive as well. My impression is, and this news seems to change by the season, but my impression is that most people on the right who are saying that they're quote unquote against CRT, not only do they know that nobody is teaching obscure legal doctrine in the classroom, but what they mean is that social justice shouldn't be held front and center, and that kids should not explicitly be made to feel guilty about things that happened in the past, that a child should not be taught, if they're not brown, that they are, to use the word of the decade, complicit. Now, I understand that. I wouldn't, if I were white, I wouldn't want my 8-year-old to be taught that they're complicit in a nakedly racist system. However, there are many of these people who clearly really just don't want these sorts of things taught at all. And what they're asking for is an educational system that would be inexcusably ignorant and uncreative in a modern nation such as this one. So I think the left and the right have a problem with critical race theory. I think the left pretends not to know what CRT means. I think that the right are sometimes cloaking what really is a desire to erase what went on before out of a sense that we need to just move on, and move on almost never makes any sense when somebody says that we need to move on. And so it's dismaying. I hate writing about CRT because nobody likes what you're saying for various reasons that everybody pretends not to understand. It's horrible. But I don't think that CRT is an irrelevant issue in our educational system. There is a problem in many districts. I'm seeing a little bit of it even in the district where my 2 children are enrolled in public schools. It can be a frightening thing, especially because nobody involved is bad. Nobody is an ideologue. Everybody is part of a larger system. Everybody has good intentions. But one worries sometimes. So we've talked about 3 things that are worrisome. I'm going to do 2 more. And the 4th one is a little weird and probably will elicit a lot of disagreement. But the longer I teach even college-age students, the more skeptical I am of the focus on writing in education. I firmly believe that we need to return to the old tradition of valuing oral expression, and that if we're going to talk about a diversity of perspectives on what students bring, then it ought to be possible to get through school and to be considered an excellent student, mostly expressing yourself orally if you learn how to do it with a certain finesse. And it starts with the fact that I have no idea why, even with my freshmen and sophomores at Columbia, that I am teaching them the art of writing the 5-paragraph essay. That, you know, we have a class, maybe they've yanked me into teaching everything under the sun. One of them is philosophy, so we've done Aristotle. And then they have to write me 5 pages. They despise doing it. In the life that they're leading now, it's the only time they ever write anything, and they'll never write again. And you know what? Because it's Columbia, they all do it well, but they hate it, and I genuinely am not sure why they have to do it that way. Because we are no longer an especially written culture unless you choose to engage in that particular aspect of things. I don't see it. More and more, because of our technology, we're an oral culture. You can get yourself across to the whole world making a recording in your basement. And that's an art. To be able to express yourself orally is as much of an art as being able to express yourself putting scratches down on some piece of paper. Now, I think that the objection to this is partly that there's a notion that to use writing is a way of organizing your thoughts. And yeah, it can be, but it's also just the way we've been taught to organize our thoughts. Somebody in ancient Greece or ancient Rome or America, until not 10 minutes ago, but maybe 45 minutes ago, would have been surprised that the only way to organize your thoughts is to write them down on a piece of paper with your fingers. People who valued orality often did not write things down. You thought to yourself how you were going to give your talk. You thought about your paragraphs in order. And the refinement was not writing something down, a very artificial activity. The refinement was thinking your thoughts with the linguistic ability that you were born with as a member of this species, and you just talked. With a lot of my students, I often wish that instead of having to sit down and do this thing that they'll never have to do again, maybe they'll have to write a memo, but they don't like writing. Most human beings don't. And notice, I'm not talking about Columbia. I'm talking about humanity, the whole planet. Writing is artificial. Most of them, I wish that I could say, you know, you got through reading Kant, you know, and you have to read it, and it was hard, but I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Now come to my office and sit and talk to me for a half hour. I have an egg timer. Of course, now that's on your phone, but I have an egg timer. You are going to talk to me for 30 minutes, and no, we're not going to have some conversation. I don't mean a lack of rigor. I mean, you are going to become some oratory student in 1915. You're going to put on a bow tie, whether you're boy, girl, or anything else, you're going to put on a bow tie, and you are going to stand in front of my window, and you're going to tell me, you're going to make a case. You're going to do it with an opening paragraph. You're going to come up with a finish. W.E.B. Du Bois did that well. That's what he thought you were supposed to do. He could write, but back then you were expected to talk. I would love it if most of my students could just talk. And yes, I'd have to grade it. I'd have to pay attention. It's not any easier for me. But do you know that based on modern estimates of how long language has existed, you know when writing came along, if all of human history were 24 hours, writing was invented at 11:56 p.m. That's what a latterly invention writing is. Writing is scratching something on a piece of paper. Great sophistication has happened without writing. Read the new controversial book, The Dawn of Everything, about how much of a civilization you can have without writing anything down. You'd be surprised how far things can go. So, I wish there were more orality in education all the way up to the highest levels. This even includes academia. So many people hate writing, and I'm really not sure why they have to do it in our times. It really worries me very much. So that's the fourth thing that worries me, and here is the fifth thing. There is something that I think really needs to end in our current situation, and that is that when we think about what it is to teach somebody, the idea that after high school there has to be more, that to be a real person you have to do this thing called going to college, I really contest the default notion of that. Unless at this point you're a centenarian, it's hard to have any real memory of the time when the idea was that you graduated from high school and then you went and you did your thing. That's the way it was until the GI Bill, which slowly penetrated this idea that you go to college after high school and that completes you in some way. Now, I'm glad I went to college. I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with college or that there's anything wrong with Stanford University, but I think that really, and this is the most quixotic of my prescriptions for whatever value they are, I think that the default notion of that is more a matter of random mission creep than anything that really makes sense, even in our society where there are certain requirements of an education that there weren't in 1945. My favorite prescription is that there should be not 12 grades, but 13. People should go to high school a little bit longer. 13th grade should be where it ends. The education before that should be richer. For one thing, it should begin with being taught to read with phonics, and we can talk about all sorts of other things, but it should be a rich and maybe even great books-infused education. But most people would stop there. There's a wonderful book that was underread called Jefferson's Children by Leon Botstein that inculcated this in me. I've given it as a gift twice. Now it's out of print, so I can't give it. But it is a wonderful book, and he and other people have made this case for 13th grade. That's the way it should be. And then after that, I really think, and this is in reference to things that came up last night, that the Germany model, for example, is one that we should think more about. And so, for example, for people in underserved, say, black communities, there's nothing odder to me when I try to take a kind of a Cessna plane view of things in terms of history, than watching any president say that the gift that you want to give people in communities like that is the opportunity to spend 4 years in college, funding them to go to college for 4 years. What is this idea that it's a default experience for a legitimate human being to go through what high school requires, then you have to go spend too much money on or go into debt for, spending 4 years living in a dorm and pretending to like Shakespeare? I have never understood why that was considered a default idea. One should choose to do that if you are the kind of person who wants that particular education. But I would venture that most people would be benefited by a strong focus on vocational education, readily available for little or no money, where the idea is that after you've had 13th grade, you go get a job in what you find interesting. You shouldn't have to wait 4 years before you go into banking, if that's something that you would like to do. If you would like to make a thoroughly middle-class existence as an electrician, my electrician, the person who fixes the electricity in my house, did not go to college. There are times when I get the feeling that he and his son have more money than me, and we have often talked about it. And for the record, they're black and they have a podcast. They lead a wonderful life, and there is nothing wrong with the fact that those two men did not go to college. And I don't see them as exceptions, and they don't see themselves as exceptions. And I think to myself, that is what we offer people from underserved communities. Now, some of them may wish to go to college, and therefore they should. But the idea that they're going to spend 4 years doing something that frankly isn't necessary is one that worries me, especially because, this is my last point, by the way, we live in an era, and that era is not going to change, when we've got these phones, most of us have this broadband, and in terms of an education, let's say that you become an electrician and you're making a good 125 a year. That's what they make, they told me. You're making a good 125 a year, and you want to know more about things. Now, let's say it's 1985. There's an encyclopedia. You can read a lot of books. You can watch a little PBS. You can catch a documentary when it comes through town or when they show it on PBS. And then you've got videotapes. Some, and they break and they fade, and that's all there is. That's changed. These days, the truth is, if you do something like really patronize the Great Courses series, it used to be called the Teaching Company, now the Great Courses, and even with them, you used to have to get videotapes. They were expensive and they broke. Now, the Great Courses are on your phone. They're just online. There are now thousands of courses. Just using that, if you did it fairly diligently, you could have almost the equivalent of a college education. It didn't exist before. Probably a few of you know that I've done great courses. I'm not saying this to push my own great courses, which are about linguistics, which is kind of a marginal subject. I'm talking about subjects that are part of a general college education. It's a great series of things, and you can do so much. Podcasts, for example. There are too many of them, but that means that there are a great many podcasts that are extremely useful, and they stay there. They're available all the time. A person today can become more widely and better educated more easily just at home than they possibly could have if someone like me was saying this 20 years ago. And it matters. The truth is that a lot of those podcasts, a lot of those great courses are better than a lot of professors are capable of pulling off, because let's face it, we professors are not hired based on our ability to teach. We're hired based on our ability to crank out research. It's different. So, I think that those 5 things, if I could wave a magic wand and see those 5 things instituted, then I would see education as a more promising experiment in this country, especially for kids who come from places where it can be harder to benefit from it, or when they need extra attention, when they've been underserved and education would raise them into a different place. I am not, you've listened to me say all this, and yet I will say, I am not an education specialist, but I am somebody who stares rather closely at a lot of the people who argue about it. And what I have shared with you are my impressions of what I've heard. Thank you for listening.
So that's a terribly provocative talk.
picked
And
somebody.
I would like about 17 points to make, but I would just like to go after which I thought was the most provocative part, which was your suggestion that we don't need to learn how to write. Because then if we don't need to learn how to write, we don't need to learn how to read, and we don't need phonics. We can just be an oral culture. We've been that for, 200,000 years, and we only, started reading, and reading is an unnatural art, as you correctly pointed out. So I just would like some clarification on that.
Just because you read doesn't mean that you should be obliged to be able to write the sorts of things that people read. Some people will write things, and that will help in education. You read it, and then you can speak what you've learned and the kinds of conclusions that your instructor has told you to come to. That's my idea. So the idea is not to go back to being a non-literate hunter-gatherer culture, but just the idea being that the written word is not seen as something that everybody should be expected to produce as well as to take in. That's my eccentric vision.
So in dual immersion programs, they typically will put a fluent Spanish speaker with a child that doesn't speak any Spanish, and they're able to pick up the dialect and say the words appropriately. What do you think about that when it pertains to Black English and the three categories that you stated, right? I'm pretty sure that the students that speak more Black English and the ones that don't speak any at all are attending some schools or communities together, community together. So what do you, I'm just trying to sort that out in my head.
Well, just give me one more sentence, just what, I didn't understand the question part.
So I'm trying to, when I look at a dual immersion program and the success of having, Spanish-speaking students with non-Spanish-speaking students in the way that they are able to pronunciate and pick up the dialect very efficiently, does that look the same between the student that speaks all Black English and the student that speaks none, and how would that help with the student in the middle, perhaps? I don't see.
Yeah. I think that the crucial thing is that immersion is important. And so if a Black English dominant kid is going to acquire skills in the standard, then they have to hear it. They have to hear it probably 5 days a week and actually interact in it and live in it. And certainly that would help this middle kid where, if anything, what I can see, it's a very interesting study. The issue is that that kid might have problems with mediating, that their problem is that they have a translation job that is an issue for them, and so they need extra attention. That immersion would, of course, help them too, because the immersion is not only learning how to say, look, there's a sun in the sky, but when do you use Black English, when do you not? And of course, nobody knows these things in any tabulated fashion, and if you tabulate it, it's not useful. You have to live it. And so that would help that kid too. And as far as I'm concerned, in a situation like that, it would help if the teacher were a native Black English speaker too. That's part of the instruction. But the idea that the kid needs to be taken aside and taught not ain't, but isn't, put a D at the end of the word cold, etc. They know that already, and that's what a lot of experiments have shown. The issue is the mediation. How do you talk as a legitimate person when there are two ways that you can talk? So that's my thought about those things.
So I'll introduce myself again. So I'm the director of the Institute for Education Sciences, and we run IPEDS, which is the premier collection system for higher education, and we also collect a lot of data on community colleges. So I was a university faculty member for a long time, and we always looked at community colleges as some secondary institution. So, and I think there's a bias among people who are highly educated and gone to places like Stanford, teach at Columbia, to think of community colleges as, somehow an inferior organization. But, they are the 13, grade 13, grade 14, and they are one of the largest deliverers of vocational education. And the fact of the matter is that we spent a lot of time documenting the incredibly high ROI for for vocational programs run by community colleges. And we're relatively late to this game to tracking all this because the system was like what you're describing. Everybody goes to a four-year school, everybody's a degree in political science or a degree in biology or linguistics. So the one thing, the next frontier for me, what we're trying to push forward is the collection of information about non-credit activity in community colleges. So in terms of enrollments, maybe as much as half of the activity that goes on in community colleges is non-credit, and there are many, many certificates that are being issued for non-credit activity. We know nothing, absolutely nothing about those. So we are doing a test in Texas to try to figure out what the ROI on non-credit activities are. And to the extent to which this works, we actually have because we're a federal agency, we're talking to OMB about expanding the collection of non-credit activities. And I think once we get better information, this kind of bias that you're talking about, where we think four-year colleges, where everybody goes to a four-year degree, I think we're in the process of illustrating the ROI for these short-term certificates, including non-credit, which right now we have no information on at all.
And you know what? This is what's needed, because I've noticed at this conference your frustration that you find truth and the world doesn't seem to listen. And so the question is, how do you get this up there? It needs to, there's a magic number, I don't know why, there need to be 10 states. 10 states where you've got the proper data, and you would find the same and useful data in every state. I am unjustifiably and hubristically sure. And once you had the data, then you have to tell the Biden administration. It has to get out there. It has to become a meme. And so the question is, how do you, as one think tank has it, turn intellect into influence? And it has to get out there as something that everybody knows, as opposed to something that's passed around at education conferences. And that's a matter of using modern media. But I'll tell you, I'm interested, and so keep me posted, please.
John, I've read dozens and dozens and dozens of your columns. I've listened to hours of your speeches. I find you to be the king of precision and nuance and even humility. Most public intellectuals will never admit they don't know something or they don't have the answer.
Well, I don't know a lot.
And you're willing to say that. And so my question, because of my bias there, who would you say is your most important critic, and what would they have to say about your work, your writings, et cetera?
What an interesting question. You mean like a critic where I listen and I think, actually, that's true.
Right. Or they've tested your assumptions the best.
I have to leave a little bit of dead air because I have to think about it. Because a lot of the people who criticize me are making up this cartoon character, and as far as I'm concerned, it literally has no effect. I don't recognize myself, and I'm busy. But in terms of somebody who doesn't like me, and I think, yeah. Here's one. No, I don't agree with. No, there's somebody. All right, I'm going to give you 15 more seconds of dead air because there is somebody. I'm just trying to think of who it is. Oh yeah, him. Michael Eric Dyson is a very prominent race commentator, and a lot of people think that he and I would have some issue. We never have, but I disagree with almost everything he thinks, and he disagrees with almost everything I think, and he actually does make me consider at times. 60% in how to be persuasive to an audience. I've learned a lot about that from him. And 40% in that he makes me think, well, I guess you can bring that in, and I guess that does shed a different light on it. He and I did a debate the other night, actually, and I found myself thinking, yeah, all right, yeah, so that's the race stuff. In linguistics, there's a whole different issue, but I doubt if that's what you're asking. So, yeah, you have to listen to your critics. And the main thing for me is that very, very, very few of them are quote-unquote crazy, and very, very few of them are badly intentioned. And so even if they're not getting you, you should listen, because often you find that, one, they might be right, and two, you learn how to get across better, because if the person thinks that when they hear you, well, a lot of people are going to think that, and it doesn't make sense to think, well, they shouldn't have thought that. No, what you think to yourself is, well, even if they shouldn't have, people are going to, how can you make them understand? I think that's important in being somebody who tries to communicate with the public.
If we're going to place greater value on oral than written communication, aren't we going to have to teach oratory and public speaking and start kids off with a mouthful of marbles? And how are we not going to end up with a series of ums and you know and like and incompetent speaking by people who have never learned to speak? Isn't that going to be just as hard as teaching them to write?
Professor Finn, you are correct. Yes, it would be difficult, but it would be worth the effort to take somebody who has marbles in their mouth and says like every 4 words and to teach them to express themselves in a more suasional way. Yes, that's a challenge, and I would find it every bit as gratifying and beautiful as teaching them how to write 5 paragraphs about what they think about something. Yeah, it would be an effort. The old oratory contests, I read about that and I think, why did we stop doing that? I'm not sure what the reason is, except for amplification technology and the fact that you don't have to project anymore, and a couple of other reasons that are no reason not to go back to it. But yeah, it would be a challenge. I'm not saying it would be easier. It's just that I think it would be more respectful of where most people more naturally come from.
You talked about the value put on college education and that it is not necessarily the path for everyone, but yet a lot of the employers seem to use that as either a signal or some sort of criterion for value. Mm-hmm. And as you think about it, if you thought about an alternative model where you break, because if the employers didn't think or place as much value in the education, then that might break the cycle and say there are various paths, all of which could, lead to something really good.
I should have said that, because that's part of the model. Yeah. Part of this becoming a meme in society would require that one by one, it would be a Spartacus kind of phenomenon, one by one, employers would stop requiring needless college degrees. And I think it's possible. I think you end up getting a backwards version of it in programs that basically get underprivileged kids' feet in the door of an organization that ordinarily would not be interested in them, but philanthropy and public relations make it so that they at least pretend. And next thing you know, you have somebody who is actually working within an organization who wouldn't have had the chance. Next step is, why do you require a BA in X, Y, or Z anyway when Rodney and Rochelle, I'm just making up 2 names, did so well? Yes, that would have to be part of it, or all of this doesn't work as well. But I think that can happen. People don't smoke anymore and people wear seatbelts. It's that kind of meme that would have to penetrate, I would hope.
So I'm still on writing, John. What makes you believe that we will have the same quality of written word if we don't have people learning how to do it and sorting through, that only the people that can do it well learn to write and everybody else learns to speak?
Well, it would be a world where fewer people did write. And to be perfectly honest, that might make for better writing, because there would be fewer people doing it who would really rather speak. I imagine that, for example, many of the people today who have careers writing for this web page or that, where they write, many of those people, I think, would be more comfortable doing a kind of a video clip where they spoke to you, and they would often be more immediate and more compelling than they are in print, because what we're genetically programmed for is to do what we're doing here right now. So what I definitely mean is there being less writing, and I think I'm getting part of that from being a linguist and knowing that there's 7,000 languages in the world. Of the 7,000, it is aggressive to say that 200 of those languages are written in any real way. The real number is somewhere around 125. We think of that as normal, but most languages are only talked, so to speak. And that means that there's some societies where a language is coming to be written, and writing is a minority phenomenon. And I often see that and I think, what's wrong with that? Why do more people have to put words on the page than already do, especially now that there's this handheld communication? Most people just talk. Why is that wrong? Oratory is always cherished in those societies. The chief gets up and just says stuff without having anything written down for 2 hours. And I think, what's wrong with that? I mean, there's a short step from that to George Washington speaking from 2 hours, except for some reason he read it from a text. What's wrong with the chief in the Native American tribe in Panama doing the same thing, where there's even somebody at the end who says what the chief said in more accessible language? There's this commentator / Ed McMahon person in a culture like that. I genuinely don't see why we can't go back to something like that. But I see the point in your eyes, and I know what you mean, but less writing to me would not be a bad thing, and I'm somebody who would much rather write than talk. I would much rather read than listen to anybody talking. But I get the feeling that I'm weird in that way. I don't think of that as a norm, and I don't seek other people to be that way. So
I'm totally sympathetic to the non-college for all orientation. That's generally where I lean as well. Though it is difficult to, I guess, get past some of the benefits that, aside from vocational, that college offers. For example, the intellectual vitality of having some of those oral arguments with peers, and even both in and out of the classroom, the extracurricular opportunities, the opportunities to interact with people who are often very different from you, either from your community background or what have you. And so I'm curious about how you would respond to, and even the exposure to the breadth of potential occupations. So how would you respond to, I guess, the loss of that if we were to shift away from a college education?
I fully understand what you mean. I fully respect and value those things. It's all I've ever known, that college experience, far beyond what facts you're going to learn, et cetera. I mean this, I'm not saying this in a snarky way. I'm not sure that those really good things justify and I mean this very, very tepidly. I'm not sure those things justify how many people we require to go through all of the rest of what college entails today. It just strikes me that we'd be okay if a smaller segment of the population experienced all of that, and that would include the different kinds of people that you meet and interact with. That is very real. That would be a benefit, but then there would be other benefits to people who quote unquote became electricians and went right out into the world and listened to podcasts. And there are other ways that they might meet other people. And you know what, if they didn't, I'm not sure that that's so important that we have needed for so many people to go to college since 1945. I take your point, because when I say this, it's like at the outer edge of my brain, my deep brain values what you're talking about. But there's a part of me that thinks it would be an okay world if many fewer people had that particular experience. I know what you mean, though. It's all yours.